Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Peter Haley, I'm a Director in Forensic Services, and today's topic is current issues with business valuations.
And I'm John Thynne. I'll be co-speaking with Peter today. What we want to talk about today is really some of the current issues we're seeing in business valuations. I think we've put in one of the titles, it's where business valuations go wrong. It's really what we want to talk about is what we're sort of seeing changing in the business valuations that we're doing. So what we want to actually cover is sort of what we're seeing in the current economic climate with the business valuations in light of that. Looking at value and what the definition of value is, what we're trying to actually achieve out of that definition. Goodwill, what is goodwill and how that actually plays into our valuations. Looking at some of these primary value drivers and how they're changing. So profitability, risk and working capital, how that's changing what we're looking for going forward. And then some of the sort of the closing thoughts.
So as John said, the first thing sort of we need to consider at any time when you're doing a valuation, but especially now, is the current economic climate. And taking into account such things as the uncertain economic outlook, both in Australia and overseas. Mining industry has stalled, which has obviously had a big effect on the Queensland economy in particular, and Western Australia.
And so it's not only from a direct mining business, but also all the indirect businesses that are supplying, or in some way, shape or form referring into the actual mining industry, or even the actual mining industry employees now going and competing in other industries.
And certainly, it has a flow-through effect in regional Queensland, where places like Rockhampton and Mackay are certainly a lot quieter, and
Townsville.
And Townsville, since what they were 3-4 years ago. And even such things like, the Brisbane Airport's put off building a new little satellite terminal they were going to build specifically for Qantas Link and the fly-in, fly-out. And that's just last month has now been deferred. So, because there's just not the demand. So, the mining industry has also flowed through to the airlines and to the airport itself in terms of its infrastructure needs.
And if we look at something like Townsville, we're doing some valuations of some retail businesses up there recently, and we could see with what actually happened with Queensland Nickel. It was almost like switching off a light in Townsville. We saw a lot of these businesses we're looking at a whole chain of these businesses that reduced their turnover in the order of sort of 40 to 45% within a couple of months, and it stayed there. And so it's gone from actually being they're quite profitable businesses to really struggling to anywhere close to break even, and they've got long 7-year leases with what they've got in their premises. So looking forward, these are retail businesses that have been affected by the mining industry.
Construction slowdown. I saw today, there was a thing in the paper about the Queensland construction industry has basically fallen off a cliff. If you look out the window at the moment, there's still plenty of cranes, but there's nothing new being started. There's not much in the pipeline at all in commercial construction in Brisbane at the moment. So 12 months time, most of those cranes will be down, all those projects will be finished. What are all those building workers going to do at that time?
It's interesting. I think it was 6 months ago we heard the story that you couldn't actually hire a crane in Brisbane. Every single crane was booked up and had forward bookings on them, and now we're starting to see the construction being completed. It's all changing.
And I actually saw something recently. At the moment, there's more cranes on the eastern seaboard of Australia than in the whole of the United States. So that's how much of a boom there has been in the last couple of years, up and down, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne predominantly. We've also got financiers pulling back again, similar to after the GFC, where maybe not cutting back borrowing totally, but certainly their loan-to-value ratios are cutting back from 60% to 50%. They're just not prepared to borrow, to lend quite as much on, especially business purchases, we found.
We actually have had a little bit of feedback from one of the large banks in particular, who sort of said to us, look, we're shutting down. Yes, we're still lending, but the actual, we're really looking at the risk profile of things, and we will just not be doing what we did last week.
Yeah. General and capital expenditure is still being deferred, so everywhere from the state government downwards, in terms of they're not spending anything on infrastructure and new projects, to just businesses in general.
And that also flows into businesses that the businesses we're valuing from the point of view that their profits are being bolstered by not actually spending the money they should be spending. So we've got essentially the third capital expenditure program is going to be required.
Digital disruption, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on, so I won't say too much on that right now. We've got changes in consumer demands. Again, we'll talk a bit more about that later on, but that's basically consumers are becoming more and more demanding. Worldwide competition, so you're no longer just competing with businesses in Australia. You're competing with businesses pretty well anywhere that can ship anywhere. I'm sure most of us out there, buy stuff on eBay, Amazon, whatever, and it could come from anywhere. And lastly,
there's stuck in there.
There's some rumours that potentially the state election might be brought forward. If that does happen, I suppose at least the one saving grace is probably will have a very short and sharp little election campaign. So maybe the normal sort of holding pattern might be avoided a bit. That businesses find an excuse to go into whenever an election is called. So all those sort of things need to be taken into account, and how it's affected business values.
So what is value? There's a whole range of values out there. What is value? I mean, I'm just flashing up on the screen now quite a few of the different definitions that are out there for the different purposes that they may be run. The majority of these have a different approach and different answer to what's coming in. Normally when we talk about value, we're talking about fair market value. We're really talking about that traditional definition, the price paid in an open, unrestricted market between a knowledgeable, willing but not anxious buyer and seller acting at arm's length. If you don't get one of those categories, technically you don't have market value. You've really got value or price that's been negotiated between two parties. And with what we're seeing happening in the marketplace, this price that's negotiated does not necessarily reflect fair market value. Actually, that last one just flashed up, value to party. That's quite often what we're actually coming up with. If you've got, in the current market, if you've got someone selling, usually they're quite motivated to sell. Someone buying is looking for a bargain, so the chances are the price is being deflated. There's not nearly as many stories today that we might have heard in the sort of the 2007, 2008, where the large listed companies coming in and paying silly prices for businesses. Those silly prices, they're the value to party. They're worth more to a larger entity than they are to the man in the street. So they're the inflated price. What we're seeing more now is the deflated prices.
And on the bottom there, we've got the lack of comparable data. So of course, unlike real estate, I think we all know that there's no database out there in Australia, certainly, of market transactions that have actually taken place. So you can't go and look at, well, what did that business sell for, or a very similar business sell for last week, last month, even last year. There's a couple of databases out there, but to be honest, they're not really worth looking at.
And the problem with those databases that are there, so there's one that I think that you probably also know, the one that's out of Perth. The ones that are there, you see a business, a bakery sold for 3 times EBITDA. What we don't know is how they calculate EBITDA. We don't know if they're looking at historical EBITDA or future EBITDA. We don't know what the multiple actually represents. We don't know what commercial wages are going through, if any commercial wages are going through. We don't know if it was a motivated sale or not. We don't know who the buyer was. We don't know if there's any sort of, was there a Woolworths next door, or there was actually no competition in the vicinity, which may be an opportunity or a curse depending which way you look at it. So it's very difficult to compare one sale to another without having all of the data. And what we'd do is really express a caution in actually comparing those type of sales.
And along that, I went to a presentation last week on a group who are putting together a database of private companies, and essentially they've somehow got legally access to the ASIC database, which there's about 5,000 private companies in Australia have to lodge accounts every year. So they're all large private companies. So they went through and what they were calling, cleansing the data and addressing all those issues that John was just mentioning. And just because of the form of the financial statements that were being lodged, they ended up with only about 2,000 of the 5,000 they could include in their database, because they just weren't confident. There just wasn't sufficient information in the financial statements for them to know exactly what they were looking at. So their database is essentially then 2,000 companies of 20 million plus turnover. So if you're trying to value, that's they're saying that's a valid database on which to base comparable transactions on, but that's obviously the 2,000 biggest entities in Australia basically. So if you're down in the more typical small medium enterprise type area of the market, which is where we tend to be, turnover anywhere from a few 100,000 up to 10, 20 million. There's just nothing out there where you can go and get any sort of reliable historical transaction data. So that brings us to market value, which is, as John was saying, is probably the most common standard of value that any business valuation tries to come up with. And the definition we've got here is, it's the amount a prudent investor is prepared to pay to get the future earnings having regard to the risk. So that should be the same, that's not just business valuations, that's any investment that you potentially look at. How much am I going to pay? How much will I get for it? So it might be even a real estate. If you're looking at what's the expected future earnings, that might be a combination of rent and capital growth and having regard to the risk. So that same sort of process should be gone into no matter what sort of investment you're looking at.
So we always talk about sort of when you're valuing an asset, that risk-return concept. Return in this case, obviously, we're talking about the profitability. That return is the future profitability, and that's something we need to stress. It's all about the future. What's happening in this business today and that we know about going into the future. It's not about the past. And this is where we saw back in 2008, 2009 when we were doing valuations, the whole market had crashed around us, yet the financial statements we're being given are showing tremendous results. So you haven't actually seen the effect coming through in the historical data being provided, but it needs to be taken into account. So different procedures need to be put into place. Now over that GFC, it's fluctuated quite a bit, but right now, we probably have come off a little bit, and the outlook is probably, I don't know if it's going to get a lot worse, but I don't think it's getting a lot better. So the future, where are we? Then you start looking at the risk, and there are so many factors to be taken into account now, and the world is becoming a smaller place, and as a result, far greater risk being taken into account. So goodwill. We talk about goodwill. What is goodwill? Commonly, if you talk to the man in the street, it's what's the reputation? How long has it been in the marketplace? How good's the product? How many clients has it got? The people love them. Their location is tremendous. None of that is commercial goodwill that you value for the sale. Commercial goodwill, again, is all about future profits over and above a benchmark return. So you need, for the infrastructure you employ in a business, you need to receive a return on that. So you need to have a profit to a certain level to give you a return on your assets. Then your profit over that is what constitutes your goodwill. So goodwill is all about future profits. It's not about all those other things. All those other things you need for a good profitable business, but if you're making a loss, no one's going to pay you goodwill for it.
Or you may have a very, very profitable business, but after taking into account the investment you need in its second dot point there, the over and above the benchmark return, which is, sorry, the first dot point, the net tangible assets. So simplistically, I remember I had a client years ago who sold picture framing, wholesaled it to all the picture framing businesses around southeast Queensland. Now he was making several $100,000 a year, which was a great return, but in order to do that, he had a stock holding of about $2 or $3 million at any one time. So he had to have all these sorts of frames in place so that when a picture framer rang up and said, I want it tomorrow, he could deliver it. So when you took into account the investment in working capital, he was getting a reasonable return on his investment. But there was no goodwill in that business, even though it was making several $100,000 a year.
The other thing I mentioned then was I was talking about commercial goodwill. Commercial goodwill is what you can sell with the business. Then you've got your personal goodwill, which attaches to individual people. And a lot of the small businesses we look at, there is quite a high level of personal goodwill attached to the principals, which you can't sell unless you can actually tie the principal to that business. And sort of typical examples might be a real estate agent. A real estate agent may have a lot of sales, and he brings in a lot of business. But if he left and went to the next place, his contacts would follow him. They wouldn't stay with the original business. Or you've got a professional advisor. financial planner, accountant, lawyer. People are going there for the person, not necessarily for the business name. So it's important to be able to distinguish between the two. I guess from the other ones we see there is builders, tradespeople, who may have actually their own contacts that refer them work. Taking those things into account is very important.
So now we move on to the methodologies that typically involved, and as we keep harking on about that, the earnings-based methodology is the first port of call because it's all about the future earnings. So some of the methodologies you use there are things, I don't know if anyone's heard these terms, but we won't go into detail with them, but it's all about future maintainable earnings. Discounted cash flow is all about the future cash flow, and the dividend payout, if someone holds a very small interest in an entity, their only return will be the future dividends they get. But again, it's all about the future and in any of those earnings.
And future profits. So each one of those, to actually gain value in those, you need to have future profits.
If, for example, a business isn't profitable, or we've certainly got to consider what, as a minimum value, what are the net realisable assets that are used in a business, and that's called an asset-based methodology. And then some other methodologies that are out there in the marketplace, there's various rules of thumb. For example, real estate property management businesses, the rent rolls, they sell on a multiple of the gross commissions earned. And that's normally based on the last 12 months. Now that's a bit of at odds with what we're saying, but that's often in terms of considering the future profits. But there's an automatic assumption that what it earned in the last 12 months, it will earn going forward.
And look, some of the banks are also employing their own rules of thumb. So for financial planners, to a certain extent, lawyers and accountants, some of the main banks have actually adopted, they'll lend, depending if you tick their other criteria, they'll lend to 2 times your EBIT. Really what they're saying is we value your business at 4 times EBIT and we'll lend to 50%. So they've actually broken that down. So they've moved away from using a capitalisation future maintainable earnings, where they've actually said, we'll look at the earnings, we have various of these that we're doing, they come to 25% capitalisation rate. That sort of morphed into we'll value the earnings by 4 and lend to 50%. Now they've actually morphed that into they'll lend to twice EBIT and no longer do a valuation. They'll look at other criteria. So there are various industries that are actually looking at things differently as well.
And I think whilst they acknowledge that that's a little bit rough and ready, because again they're only lending to 50%, there's a bit of give and a bit of play in terms of the equity in the thing. So the downside is not that high for them.
Move on to some of the primary value drivers and how they're changing. So look at profitability. You would have heard us now say this word quite a few times. It's all about the future. It's not about the past. And that is really where we're seeing a changing environment in what we're doing. We're seeing customers demanding a different approach. They want things now. We're seeing suppliers changing what they're doing. We're seeing competitive products coming in. We're seeing the worldwide competition starting to flare up with the cost of freight. It takes 2 seconds to bring something in from China, and they have no shop front here, so they don't have the costs here, so they can compete on a world scale. We're seeing offshoring for staffing. We're seeing technology and software changing. And these are all the things from a profitability viewpoint. If we're assessing what the actual earnings of the business are, you'll have your historical trading performance, and that's going to be your proxy for the future, but you still need to look at that to say, how are things going to change in this business? And obviously the next profit driver we're looking at is risk. What are the risks of things changing? The point I've got here with client loyalty, more and more we're seeing loyalty of not only clients, but also suppliers and staff changing. Clients, once upon a time, used to shake your hand and you never had to worry about that client again. Now it's all being, well, what's the price? What's the price? What's the price? I want more, I want to pay less. You need to do different things to be able to keep that client, that perceived client loyalty there. And they're the sort of things we need to take into account in our business valuations. Deferred expenditure, we've got on 2 bases we mentioned earlier. Your repairs and maintenance is being deferred in a lot of businesses. The preventative maintenance programs with capital equipment they've got there, that's being deferred. So we've got this almost pent-up repairs and maintenance program that's going to need to be spent. We've got a bolstering of profit because they're actually not spending this. But the future is they need to spend more or replace that equipment, which in the end is going to be greater capital expenditure. And on the capital expenditure side, again, the decision to actually replace equipment for more efficient equipment is being deferred purely because of the one, they can't afford it, or two, the financing, they just don't want to take the risk. Whenever we're doing a valuation, we need to actually put it after a commercial salary for the owners to take that into account, depending on the valuation methodology you're putting in place. But on the majority of them, it's after a commercial salary for the owners and after commercial adjustment for all the infrastructure used, and the obvious one there is going to be the business premises being used to make sure that's on a commercial basis.
So the second primary driver after profitability is the risks. So things you need to take into account there are things like industry factors. You know, what's happening in this particular industry? Is anything happening? Is the industry dying? Is the industry growing? Economic factors. So is the economy in general, is it buoyant? Is the economy in, we said before, Rocky and Mackay is not real good, or Townsville? So you value in business in one of those particular locations, you've got to take into account the local economy, not just the state and the national and the international economy.
And to a certain extent, you know, we can't see the future, but at the same time we can read the signs that are there today. So where is the future going? You know, if we look at the housing industry, and I'm by no means a property expert, but you look at something like Sydney and Melbourne have been running hot. Sydney in particular. Now Sydney, all reports, is it's starting to come off. Brisbane's starting to actually take off a little bit. Is that going to continue? Do you need to start looking at different sectors of the Brisbane market? Is the inner city housing, or units, is that now, the oversupply is sort of being talked about, is that going to affect the apartments outside of the inner city? What's happening with housing, different price brackets? Will this continue to move up the coast? If you actually look at the historical trends, the price movements tend to actually travel up the coast. So if it's big in Sydney, there'll be a delay to come big up here. If it's dying in Sydney, there'll be a little bit of delay to come dying up here. What's the actual trend that's there?
Other risks, the software and the technology involved in the business in question. So is it a business that's heavily reliant on this sort of stuff? So even things like the legal industry, there's now been software developed that can essentially do all the searching of case law and whatever, and even write a legal advice.
I think was it Lawless over in the States. They use the artificial intelligence robots over there. They got the artificial intelligence to sit the bar exam and passed.
So you got things like that. So where it's just, even 12 months ago you wouldn't have imagined something like that could happen. So
you got the Xero and the like coming in here. It's got intuitive software that downloads all of the your bank details and pre-does some of the actual transactions.
Yep. As John mentioned earlier, you got consumer demands. It's now more than ever. They want it now. It's like the guy with his picture framing. That was probably 10 years ago that was, but it's certainly more the case with a lot more businesses now that. And even in our own business, I can remember clients used to drop off their tax work, and if they didn't get it back for 3 months, they didn't really care. Whereas now, if it's not back in three weeks, then they start to be chasing it, and everything's just on a shorter time frame than it ever has been.
And businesses find that as well, and we'll talk about this very shortly in the next slide. We've got places that their businesses are now required to carry a wider range of stock and have the stock on hand. So if you're looking at a timber yard, builders will call up saying, have you got this timber? They'll say no. They'll go to the next place to actually get it. A couple of weeks ago, our dryer at home blew up, so I had to get a new dryer. I rang Good Guys. They didn't have any on the one I wanted there, so I rang Harvey Norman. They did, and I picked it up that afternoon. It was exactly the same price. I just wanted it that day.
Price pressures. So again, with new entrants to the market, people expecting things quicker and cheaper.
and not really respecting the process that goes into it, so not respecting the time and the cost of actually achieving that result. And there's more shopping around now.
Other risks you've got are things like, your staff costs versus offshoring. So, for example, in the accountancy profession, you can employ a 3-year qualified CPA in the Philippines for probably about 13,000 Australian a year, and that's versus you get a graduate out of uni here now for 50,000 a year. So, but if you don't hire your graduates, well, where are your staff on the ground going to be in 5 years' time? So you've got to weigh up the short-term cost saving versus the long-term viability of your business in a lot of these cases. And finally, just the stability of customers and suppliers. So all your customers and your suppliers are also facing all these same sort of pressures and risks that you're facing in your business. And if you're heavily reliant on 1 or 2 customers or 1 or 2 suppliers and something happens to them, well, then that's going to have a flow-on effect into your business.
And the last of these primary drivers we want to talk about is working capital. And we've already touched on this. There's a greater requirement for holding your working capital, particularly as far as the stock goes. Businesses now tend to be, unless they can find a place to actually deliver stock to them just in time, so essentially same day, they tend to need to carry the stock themselves. Otherwise, the actual client will shop around. So there's a larger requirement for stock. Customer terms, they're tending to, because they can shop around, they tend to push their suppliers around. So our clients' businesses, so debtors tend to be blowing out a little bit further. So we're actually getting a greater requirement for funding debtors, a greater requirement for funding your stock. So again, our working capital is increasing. And the effect of this is the business values are coming up the same. So when you actually have a greater working capital requirement, you're going to have a lower level of goodwill. So the working capital is increasing. There's a greater requirement for investing in infrastructure, and whether they're doing it now or they're going to need to do it down the track, there's a greater requirement for infrastructure so we can actually get the efficiencies within our business and actually harness the technology that's happening out there. But the problem with some of this infrastructure is that it's usually that specific and that state-of-the-art that it actually depreciates very quickly. I'll use an example of I think it was last year, I valued a large bottling factory. And they just stuck in 2 bottling lines, and each one of the bottling lines was about $5 million. Fantastic operation to see. The actual core machinery cost about $3.5 and about $1.5 million to actually set it up and get it all calibrated. But there was not one person on the actual line. So from where the plastic nib came in to actually extrude the bottle through to the actual wrapped pallet of bottles at the water bottles at the end, there wasn't a human on the line. Amazing thing to watch. But because there was $1.5 million to actually set it up, if this business goes belly up, you rip the equipment out of there, you've just lost your $1.5 million you've invested there, and the equipment's used, it's no longer state-of-the-art. So if you got $1.5 million on a sale of $5 million worth of investment, you're probably doing well. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of the businesses we're valuing, that the actual initial capital expenditure being put in to set up or to re-establish the business really is a sunk cost. What we are looking at, essentially, the value sits in the cash flow generated, not in the infrastructure that's there. And that's probably really common in retail businesses. So you'll see the franchises or retail businesses that are set up in the shopping centres. They've got a 5-year lease. At the end of that 5 years, there's no value what there unless they get another lease. So it's really the cash flow you're valuing, not the net assets that are there.
I had this argument with an accountant last week where it was an argument over a franchise partnership, and they'd spent $240,000 to set up a retail food franchise, and he was trying to argue, well, it's got to be worth at least $240,000, and I said, well, no, because if this business isn't profitable and they walk away, no one's going to pay them $240,000 for the fit out. That's a sunk cost. That's just gone. So it's only ever worth now the profits it's going to make over the next 7 years, which was the term of the lease and the franchise agreement, and then an allowance in there for a little bit of a refurb of the fit out, probably 3 or 4 years' time, just to freshen it up a bit. So that's probably a prime example of why it's what's happened in the past is not necessarily all that relevant. It's all about the future.
And as part of that security of tenure is extremely important when we actually look to value the businesses. If you don't have that security of tenure, you haven't really got the actual value of the assets underneath. A couple of quick examples, and we're sort of running on that sort of 30 minutes now, so we'll be quite quick going through these. They're just really to highlight a couple of things. The first one is a plumbing business, plumbing supply business we valued earlier this year. This business has been historically trading around $45 million a year and had been doing really, really well. It actually had one of the leading plumbing brands, and what it actually managed to do, because it had the leading plumbing brand, it had it forever and a day. It was able to have a lot of minor brands with it, but people would come to them for the major brand, and they'd sell all the minor brands to go along to support the major sale they were making. They got advised recently that another competitor is going to actually be given the rights to use this or to actually market this brand, and that over time they're going to stop. Now, what that's actually meant for their business, if we just look at this major brand that's being sold, that represents 43% of this business, but the on sales will probably be another 20 to 30%. So where's the business after losing the supplier? So quite often we see there's no contract in place for the supplier, but they've had them forever and a day, so we just assume they're going to actually stay into the future. But when we're actually looking at the risks with that business, we need to consider what would be the effect if we lost one of those suppliers. And the effect with this one was it went from making a $5 million profit to a $2 million loss overnight.
Second example, sort of an example of the sort of businesses we see starting up as a disruptor. This is one that was, you know, at the moment if you get a parcel delivered by Australia Post and it's not, you're not home, you get the little card left there and it says, you know, go and pick it up from the post office. Well, they were getting in with a lot of the courier companies, and instead of getting the little card that says pick it up at the post office, or historically the courier company used to have to come back, whereas Australia Post could tell you go to the post office and pick it up, courier companies just had to keep coming back or trying to make an arrangement for when you would be there. So what they've done is go around and try to get arrangements with all the newsagents where the news agencies become the depot. So instead of the courier having to come back, which might cost, you know, $30 in time, they pay the newsagent $5 or $8 to hold the parcel until the customer can get there. So this is a start-up business, and it had only been going about 12 months, and it only, you know, didn't really have the volume up to make it profitable yet. And it all depended on, it needed a lot more cash to carry it until it did start making profits. And the guys who came up with the idea had run out of money. So how would you value that going, you know, to a potential investor? And what they ended up doing with a deal with someone was that they agreed to sell 49% of the business, in essence, for the cash they thought they'd need over the next 2 years or so until such time it would become profitable. So there wasn't really a valuation as such done. It was more just a how much do we need, and the investor said, I'm prepared to take a punt. And that's really what I'm seeing a lot of at the moment with these startup new type businesses, because no one knows how they're going to go. You can do cash flow projections, you can do all sorts of stuff, but it's very hard to try and predict exactly what the sales will be. And the number of times I've seen what they predicted being either way over or way under what ends up happening is I don't know why they bother going through the exercise to some extent.
The last one to look at it was essentially the effect of the mining industry, and oddly enough, given our specifically though, we've seen two of these businesses. The one I was talking about, it's manufacture of mobile camps. So these campsites, essentially they're, for other word, it's essentially a huge donga. They can sit them on the back of trucks and take them around, a 40-foot container type size, but they're purpose-built, or they can actually be on their own wheels. There have been a couple of these businesses through the mining industry doing extremely well when the actual mining was in exploratory stage. So they moved from well site to well site doing the drills. This business in particular was turning out about $45 million, trading extremely well. Then the 2015 we looked at it. We knew the oil and gas industry had stalled, and we fully expected this thing to have died, but in the 15 results I was given, it still had those sales in there. So we asked for the 16 management accounts and the 16 results, and that's when we saw the actual turn-off, and it literally was like a tap. The contracts stopped coming in one day, and then once they expired, those contracts were fulfilled, this business had no more. So it's tried to re-establish itself in another direction, but again, with the tight economy we've got at the moment, hasn't been able to. So that business is now looking to close up. When less than a year ago, it was making, I think it was $6-7 million a year.
So when John says the contracts, what they actually did was they'd lease out all these, essentially a whole camp. The mining company would say, I want a camp in XYZ location for the next 3 years while they establish the wellhead and whatever. And so once those lease agreements had expired, the business just died because there were no new leases coming in. So just to finish off then, a few closing thoughts and takeaways. So as we kept saying, I will say it one more time, it's all about the future. If you've got a business, you might have had a great idea and you think it's going to continue forever, but someone else will move into your turf. If someone else will want to cut.
If you've got a niche, someone's going to try to cut your grass.
Yeah. And risk is all-encompassing. So, I went through all those risk factors earlier. So it's not just the risk of your particular business; it's the risk of the economy, the risk of a whole lot of other factors in there.
And we all know the big examples of digital disruption. We look at something like a couple of years ago, it was Borders books, and bookstores are now dying, and you've got Amazon. We had Blockbuster Video, now we've got Netflix. We had taxis licenses got up to about $500,000 each. Now they're arguably worthless, and we have Ubers. The world's changing.
And consumer preferences are changing. But about the only thing that's not changing is, they want it faster and faster.
And are going to be price competitive. So obviously these are generalizations, but the majority of the clients we're seeing, they're looking at price and what they can get for it, as opposed to looking for quality and where they need to go for it.
And it even extends through to food franchises, things like that. Even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, McDonald's was the absolute king. Well, now they're really struggling in terms of maintaining their viability because they tried to reinvent themselves as a healthy option, and that just hasn't really worked, I don't think so.
We just valued one franchise chain, and I think there were 18 businesses in Queensland who were part of this that this crowd owned, and the investment would have been over $10 million, and within the space of 1 year, well over half of these franchises were making a loss.
So the investment's in the fit-out. So these are sort of family restaurant-y sort of things, yeah.
And what it's just really showing is that you need to move for the times. Things come in with fads and move quickly. The next thing comes along and people move their preferences. We're going to have to look at where we're sort of taking our takeaway from, or our restaurants. How often do we go back to the same restaurant year after year? A new chain comes out, we go and try it. What happened to the old chain we were using? That's where we really want to get to today. So it's really just a little bit of a taste of what we're seeing out there. If you have any questions, by all means, you'll get an email from us, from Bridget. By all means, shoot us any questions you have, and we'll give you a call and we can discuss those. But for now, thank you.
Yep. Thanks for listening.